Hi, my name is Keller McFall, and I'm one of the instructors of Philosophy of Sports. I know we have met virtually, and some of you have never seen me, so now you have. I want to take just a minute to talk to you about the Unit 2 papers, which I just finished grading, and give you some suggestions that you might apply to the remaining papers for the semester. Um, and I should start by saying many of them were good. Many of them showed that you had read the material and tried to engage the material. Many of them showed, and most of them showed that you were trying to do a good job, and I applaud you for that. But there were some common concerns, common places where you could have used that evidence better or thought about the material more carefully. And so I wanted to flag those for you because um, they're aspects of critical thinking that you can apply to the rest of the papers in the semester. Um, And so here I want to briefly talk about three, again in the context of the Unit 2 paper, this paper that um, asks you to decide whether Newman should continue to have athletics. So, first suggestion, anytime you're going to answer any of these questions, you need to start by considering what it is you need to collect or analyze in terms of answering this particular question. So one common failing, uh, this is not true for everybody, but for many of you, um, you never actually said what purpose athletics was supposed to serve at Newman. Um, and if you're going to answer the question of whether Newman should have athletics, then you need to really begin with that question of what it's supposed to do. You had the mission statement for Newman Athletics compared to USC and Georgia. And many of you thought about Newman in the same way you would have thought about Georgia or USC or KU or K State. And there are some similarities there, but there are many differences. Um, and so you needed at the beginning of this question to be very specific about saying, okay, what is it about Newman that's different, and how are athletics supposed to function at Newman? Um, the same can be said for many of the other questions that you're going to be addressing in this course. Um, and in a very practical sense, when you're sitting down to write this paper, that's where I would start. This is the question. What do I need to know to answer the question? And what do I not need to know? What things are interesting or relevant in other cases, but not relevant for this? The second issue that came up, and this was a really important one for this paper and a really important one for this course, is thinking about how you evaluate evidence. Many of you did a wonderful job of bringing lots of evidence from the articles in. But many of you had a hard time thinking through how to use that evidence effectively and what that evidence showed for a place like Newman. So, for instance, many of you talked about the financial costs of athletics at education. That's a really important point, and I'm really pleased that you picked up on that. But the article that we gave you primarily talked about Division I schools. And rarely did you, or well, that's not fair. Some of you picked up on that and talked about that in your papers. Some of you did not. Um, in the same way, um, there was a variety of evidence about the academic importance or the impact sports has to play on people's academic performance. Um, some of that was from high schools. Some of that was from D1 schools. Some of it was claimed but not supported. Right? All of you, in one way or the other, use some variety of that evidence, and that's really good. But most of you could have benefited from thinking more carefully about what specific schools those studies addressed, how they match Newman, and whether the conclusions they drew could usefully be applied to Newman. Many of you are nurses. Not all of you, but many of you are going to be nurses. And you will have been and will be reading, citing, analyzing, employing scientific studies about things from medication or other kind of therapies that are applied to patient care. You should use the same process that you would use in looking at one of those studies, in looking at the studies we're citing here about sports. In fact, that's one of the reasons we ask you to do these kinds of courses, the ones that students usually call NSP courses, because we want you to apply the same kind of skills you will use in your profession to a different body of material, so you will get practice using those kind of skills in a different environment. Because that will help you when you take those skills back to your professional environment. And so I want you to think, and again this applies to all of you, but especially the nurses, think about the ways in which the questions you would ask of a study about research on medication, think about the ways you would ask those same questions to a study about sports, right? So you would ask, if you were looking at a study of a drug, what population did they administer the drug during the study? Many studies, for instance, suffer because many trials suffer because it's only males in the study. And so if there are impacts of a drug that are specifically applicable to women, they are not picked up in the study. Ask that same questions about the studies that you read for today. For instance, the study in the Atlantic article about high school students that made a lot of claims about the academic impact on high schools. Excuse me. Those are high school students. They have some similarities to college students, but they're not exactly the same. Is there a way in which applying that research to college students, is that valid? Are there ways you would suspect that data? How can you use that data given that it's a different sample population that you're trying to apply it to? Same is true for D1 schools. Sorry for that long pause, I was reading my notes. Same applies for D1 schools. In D1, mostly, universities have 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 50,000 students. I come from Michigan. I went to a school that had 48,000 students, and then a grad school that had almost 60,000 people. The role of athletics is very different there. Different in interesting ways, and that's a longer discussion than we have time to have now. Does that change the way you interpret the data? If you are looking at a drug trial, right, you are going to look at it and ask if the claims that they're making have support. Right? Many of you cited the articles here, but didn't ask where the author's conclusions, or at least didn't talk about where the author got their conclusions. Some of the author's conclusions, the articles, the evidence that the author cited, did have scholarly research that they used to try and support the conclusions they drew. Others of it didn't. And so many of you cited, I think he was the provost of Oklahoma or Oklahoma State, many of you cited the benefits he gave. If you actually look at that article carefully, there's no proof for that other than his anecdotal impressions. There is proof in the Ripley article, and there is proof in the counter to Ripley's article of Bowen and somebody, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. Do you believe their proof? And why do you believe it? Right? You would do this if you're a nurse looking at a medical study. Do the same thing for these kind of studies that we're using in this class. And if you don't seem to if it doesn't seem to be supported, then don't use it. If it seems to contradict the evidence, use it, but say so, right? And so, broadly speaking, I think you need to think about these kind of questions or these kind of issues as you're citing evidence, right? When you don't have When you don't have enough evidence don't have enough evidence for a claim, say so. When your evidence is anecdotal, and many of you made claims that were anecdotal based on your experience at Newman, that is a perfectly valid form of evidence. But acknowledge that it's anecdotal. Acknowledge that this is one case that you observe, and you don't have other studies to back it up. Make that clear. If you have evidence that doesn't quite fit, right, that doesn't quite match the environment here at Newman, acknowledge this and speculate a little bit about how applicable this evidence is at Newman. Are the studies, for instance, that Bowen is citing that are primarily from D1 or D3 schools, do those really fit the environment at Newman? A final area of thinking about evidence. Always ask yourself the counterfactual question. If you don't do this, what would then happen? What could then happen? Many of you talked about the money that is spent with athletics, and that money accomplishes good academic outcomes because it allows athletes to be at Newman and allows, in fact, athletes to take advantage of Newman's education. That's a perfectly fine point, but you then have to ask, if we didn't spend that money on athletics at Newman, what could we spend it on, and would the results be just as good or perhaps better? For instance, if we didn't spend the money on scholarship for athletes, that money wouldn't just go away. Could we then turn it around and apply it to to scholarships for everybody? Right? If we didn't spend money on sports, could we spend that money on instructional equipment, better computers, more bandwidth? Training for professors so that they are better teachers. I'm just kind of brainstorming now. And it may well be that the answer is no to that question. But to make a logically coherent argument, you have to ask that counterfactual. Right? So, these are kind of basic principles of making logical arguments that you need to kind of carry on forward and apply to the other things. Remember, again, just kind of to summarize, look specifically at what the question is and what you need to know to answer the question. Evaluate the evidence carefully, in the same way you would evaluate a scientific study, so that you are certain of what it says, and then acknowledge in your paper the limitations of that evidence or the applicability of that evidence. And then always ask the counterfactual question, if we didn't do that, what else could we do? If this didn't apply, what else would happen? One last example that kind of sorts all of this stuff together. Many of you talked about the creation of a campus community. This is a big deal in the articles that you read. And it's an important question. Right? This comes back to the purpose of sports, right? What do you need to know to answer the question? Well, you need to know the purpose of sports at Newman. Well, if you actually read the Newman mission statements, it doesn't talk about creating a campus community. That's not what sports at Newman are for. And in fact, if you've ever gone to a Newman game, the number of people who go is preciously few. The number of people who are there are almost always from the community people on campus, right? So we don't make much money fundraising for athletics that goes anywhere other than athletics because we don't attract people from across the community. Does that question really apply, right? In the same way, evaluate the evidence carefully. All of these studies that talk about the creation of campus community that you cited are, broadly speaking, either in high schools, which is a different environment, right? Or in D1 schools. So how does that apply to Newman? And then ask that counterfactual. If we didn't try and use athletics to create community, what other ways could we use those same resources to create community? Right? So all of this is not to say that you did a poor job. Many of you did very well and nobody did poorly. And I'm glad that you appear to have been reading most or all of the materials. But as you think about the coming papers, and especially the research paper, think about how you might use these principles to shape those next papers and improve your grade. So that's really all I have to say now. I wanted to keep this relatively brief. I would just encourage you, even though this is an online course and you are scattered across the country, to take advantage of Professor Findling and I. Much of this will be by phone. You are out of town on occasion over summer, or you're just living out of town, and Professor Findling and I are traveling or otherwise engaged. But we're always happy to talk to you on the phone. We're always happy to Skype with you, or we're happy to meet with you in our office. So just shoot us an email or a text and figure out how that can be. So have a great rest of July. Keep working hard on the weekly units, but don't forget the research paper and leave that till the very end. So thank you much.